Metroid Prime Pinball delivered a bizarre yet fascinating experience in 2005, one that remains just as strange today. The premise of the game is straightforward and almost excessively literal. What would happen if you remade Metroid Prime 1 as a pinball game? I'm revisiting every game in the Metroid franchise this year since the release of Metroid Prime Remastered, and I just couldn't allow myself to skip this forgotten entry like the rest of society did. So in this video, we'll explore the many intriguing, quirky details about this extremely niche experience and how it holds up almost 20 years later. What I found surprised me in both good and bad ways, and the Metroid fan in me just had to talk about it. Please hit subscribe to support the channel. I've got a lot more Metroid content coming, and let's dive in. Metroid Prime Pinball is perhaps one of the strangest games I've ever played conceptually, and I thought that in 2005 as well, and not just because it's a Metroid pinball game. I actually don't think the general idea of a Metroid pinball game is quite as far-fetched or even offensive of a concept as some implied when it first came out, even though I agree no one was really asking for this. After all, Metroid is a franchise where you spend about a third of your time rolling around in a powered-up ball. The truly interesting part of this game isn't that it's pinball, but the fact that it's literally a direct adaptation of Metroid Prime 1 in pinball form, despite excluding some super obvious pieces that should have been there. More on that in a moment. This isn't a general pinball game with Metroid themes and levels spanning different entries in the franchise. No, it's a loose remake of the original Metroid Prime in pinball form, recapturing many of the significant events, progression, power-ups, and world interactions of that full-sized game. The actual pinball gameplay mechanics are fine, but they generally take a back seat behind the specific mission of recapturing some of the magic of Metroid Prime 1 in pinball form. So in Metroid Prime Pinball, each pinball table represents a different region of Metroid Prime, and for the most part they look and feel great on the limited hardware. You have your Talon overworld board, complete with rain effects, the Phendrana drifts, the Phazon mines, even the endgame boss fights are recreated in pinball glory with a couple of bonus tables and missions. The general atmosphere, music, and style of these regions are captured surprisingly well as pinball tables, and mechanically the game is enjoyable to play. However, major caveat here, bizarrely, the Chozo ruins are missing from the game entirely, and the Magmor caverns are only available in a super simple multiplayer mission mode, even though these are the two regions you probably visit the most frequently in the original game. This makes zero sense to me, I just don't get it. Metroid Prime Pinball is already a very small game, so it's super strange that two of the most important areas from the original aren't even part of the core experience. The Chozo Ruins would have been a cool maze-like board with puzzle elements and moody music, while the Magmor Caverns could be glowing with fiery hazards. Instead, the Magmor Caverns are an overly simplistic board locked behind local multiplayer. If you decide to make your pinball game a near literal translation of another game, I don't see why you'd leave out two of the most important areas, but I digress. Anyway, you basically progress by playing pinball across the different regions that are included, and on each board there are activities or boss battles you can trigger in between normal play, which award you with power-ups or Chozo artifacts if you complete them successfully. And after collecting 12 artifacts, you unlock an additional scenario to fight the final boss sequence, which I found to be shockingly difficult for a casual pinball title. Even the micro-events that happen on these boards directly mirror what happened in the full Metroid Prime game. On the pirate frigate, you have to defeat space pirates. On the Talon overworld, you're fighting creatures that spring out of the ground in the rain. In the Phazon mines, you're fighting the Omega pirate, Thardis, and the Phendrana drifts. It's all here, except of course for anything in the Chozo ruins or Magmor caverns again. You can even trigger alternate gameplay segments where Samus emerges from the morph ball to shoot at waves of enemies, perform a wall jump minigame, battle Metroids, the list goes on. These activities do help break up the pinball gameplay and add some fun variety. The game even includes a rumble pack to simulate the shaking of the table and make certain events more immersive. Now, all of this attention to detail is appreciated, but it also further emphasizes what I think is the strangest aspect of Metroid Prime Pinball, which I already alluded to earlier. This game does a faithful job of recreating the parts of Metroid Prime that are here, but the game just feels so small and almost unfinished, a strange mix of nuanced attention to detail combined with huge gaps in content. You can see everything this game has to offer in about 30 to 45 minutes. In fact, there isn't even a save option of any kind since it's so small. On top of missing certain game environments entirely, some of the boards that are here are also nothing more than simple boss fights. For example, Phendrana and the Phazon Mines really don't have anything to offer besides their respective boss fights, and then you're teleported elsewhere. The same is true for the endgame tables. So that means the Pirate Frigate and Talon Overworld are really the only two tables with a significant number of activities to reward artifacts or continuous pinball play. It just seems like if you're only going to have 4 or 5 pinball tables, and not the full set of at least 6 or 7 that a complete adaptation would require, those 4 tables should at least be robust and content rich. These gaps in content are further exemplified by the main menu, where there's only 2 single-player modes, multi-mission and single mission. Multi-mission is the mode that closely simulates the full Prime experience, even though it's really just stitching single missions together by hopping between tables collecting artifacts. Single mission just lets you pick one of those stages and play them in isolation, but for the tables that are primarily just boss fights, there isn't really a lot of replay interest there. So if all you want to do is jump in and play some traditional pinball with a Metroid theme, there's really only 1 or 2 tables available for you, which is kind of crazy. Multiplayer is also extremely bare bones. Only 1 board and 1 mode are available, and the board is extremely basic. This mode is simply a race to 100,000 points, first person there wins. I have to wonder how many people ever actually played this. This is by far the least interesting board visually, and in terms of interactivity, this whole mode just feels very tacked on. Finally, the options menu is also comically empty, with only the strange options of turning the backlight and rumble features on and off. Again, even this just feels like it could have been omitted entirely or expanded somehow. Now, I do want to reiterate that the content that is here actually is pretty fun, and the critics seem to mostly agree. Interestingly, Metroid Prime Pinball was fairly well received when it launched, and comfortably sits at a 79 Metacritic rating with only 1 negative review. Reading these reviews is sort of entertaining in itself, though the general consensus again seems to be that it looks and plays fine, but just lacks enough content. My personal favorite review says this game sets the bar high for other pinball action games to come, as though this was supposed to spawn a bunch of other pinball game spin-offs or something. Maybe someday we'll get a Kirby pinball game where he's rolling around the board, sucking up enemies and power-ups. I digress. So anyway, I think to really maximize its pinball potential, Metroid Prime Pinball needed to do one of 2 things. The first option we already discussed, that would be to include meaningful tables for every part of the complete Metroid Prime experience, tables that work for both free play and adventure mode. The second option would be to drop the strict adherence to only Metroid Prime 1 content and provide a more general Metroid pinball experience. I wish the game had delivered on this second option. Metroid Prime Pinball came out in 2005, and by then there were plenty of Metroid games to draw inspiration from, including 2004's excellent Metroid Prime 2 Echoes the year prior, which was actually more relevant at the time of Pinball's release, so the hyper-focus on the original game is a bit odd, since that was already 3 years old at the time. Yes, I understand development cycles, but a game this small couldn't have taken that much time to build. I think it would be kind of cool to see a Metroid pinball game that spanned multiple games, at least as cool as a pinball game can be, featuring levels like Brinstar or Norfair, the Sanctuary Fortress or Torvus Bog, a space station sector for Metroid Fusion with X-parasites transforming the board. There's a weird amount of potential here. I would have preferred less of an emphasis on recreating Metroid Prime 1 as a pinball game, and more emphasis on just delivering a deeper, content-rich pinball experience spanning the Metroid franchise and just kind of loosely connecting them all somehow. Honestly, I could even see a follow-up to Metroid Prime Pinball that would now span 3 decades of Metroid across different modes and tables. I'm not exactly wanting or hoping for a sequel, but I would definitely play one, I'll admit it. Metroid Prime Pinball at least proved this concept can work on a functional and aesthetic level before it was buried in gaming history, and part of me is curious to see what a more robust iteration might look like. To be clear, this is not how Nintendo should be spending their development resources in the future, it's just an interesting thought. A couple other closing quirks worth mentioning. First, this game can be surprisingly difficult. Collecting 12 artifacts to reach the endgame scenario in a single run is somewhat challenging in itself, and then the final scenario is punishingly difficult. Losing a single life sends you back to the original boards to fight your way back again. Also, because this is a pinball game, sometimes you can lose a ball or die for reasons that simply aren't your fault. The morph ball can occasionally fall between the pinball flippers at an angle where you can't reach it. This can be frustrating when you have 11 of the 12 artifacts and you die for reasons you can't prevent and have to start all over. There is a table shake mechanic you can try by swiping the screen, but in reality, there's no way you can react fast enough to move your thumb off the buttons and swipe before the ball is long gone. There's also a high score leaderboard, but it's local only from what I can tell, which is sort of silly considering the DS did have online capabilities. Again, it's also strange to me that multiplayer is limited to only one board with the Magmore Caverns and one simple mode of racing to 100,000 points. This is especially odd because it seems like the Talon Overworld and Pirate Frigate at least could have supported multiplayer modes, since those are the two other boards that you can free play endlessly beyond just the boss fights. Anyway, this video was mostly a fun diversion through Metroid history, and it's starting to get as long as the game itself, so I'm going to end it here. But please hit subscribe to stay tuned for more substantial content on other Metroid titles coming soon. Thanks for watching.